Hi team, it's Miss Hamblett here. Today we're going to be doing a rounding review. You can find this work on page 42 through 46 of your math packet. So remember, when we are rounding to the closest tens number, we are finding which tens number our number is closest to. When we are rounding to the closest hundreds number, we are finding which hundreds number our number is closest to. We're going to be using a number line to find which tens number our number is closest to, or which hundreds number our number is closest to. So we're going to go through a few steps to review how we do that, and then we'll go over a few practice problems. So the first step should always be to annotate our problem. As we annotate, we're going to ask ourselves, what are you rounding to? Here's an example. The problem is, what is 748 rounded to the nearest hundred? I circled 748 because that's the number I'm rounding, and I boxed in nearest hundred to remind myself that I'm rounding to the nearest hundred. Next, I'm going to draw my number line and label with the correct endpoints. So I drew my number line. When I am rounding to the nearest hundred, my endpoints need to be hundreds numbers, so I can find out which hundreds number my number is closest to. If I'm rounding to the nearest tens number, my endpoints need to be tens numbers, so I can find out which tens number my number is closest to. In this problem, I know I'm rounding to the nearest hundred. That means I know that my endpoints need to be hundreds numbers. I'm rounding 748. I know the two closest hundreds numbers to 748 are 700, so that will be my first endpoint, and 800. That will be my second endpoint. Remember, when we're rounding to the nearest hundred, our endpoints need to be hundreds numbers. My next step is to label my midpoint. I know my midpoint on my number line is the number in between, equally in between my two endpoints. The midpoint is in the middle between my two endpoints. I know between 700 and 800, my midpoint is going to be 750. 750 is in between 700 and 800. Now that I have my midpoints and my endpoints, my next step is to mark the number that I'm going to be rounding. You'll notice I have my endpoints, 700 and 800. My midpoint that I found was 750. Before I mark my number on my number line, I'm going to fill in my number lines with tens numbers. Notice I filled in my number lines with tens numbers, which will make it easier for me to mark the number I'm trying to round. So I have 710, 720, 730, 740. I already had 750 because that's my midpoint. 760, 770, 780, 790, 800 was my next endpoint. Now I'm going to mark the number I am rounding. I'm going to go back in my problem, look at my annotations. I know I'm rounding 748. I'm going to star 748 on my number line. I know it's in between 740 and 750, so this is where I will start on my number line. My last step will be to ask myself, which endpoint is my number closest to? So I'm going to look at my number line, and I'm going to think which endpoint, 700 or 800, is my number closest to. I have my star right here to mark my number. I know that this marking is closer to 700, not 800. I know it's closer to 700, not 800. If you're having a tough time seeing that, you can think that it's on this side of my midpoint, which means it needs to be closer to my first endpoint. So the last step was that I look at my number line. I see that 748 is closer to 700. So I know that 748 rounded to the closest hundreds number is 700. We're going to do a few more review problems in our packet, and then I'll show you the answers to a few of the other pages. So this is number 7 on page 43 of your packet. I'll walk you through this one because it's rounding to the nearest 10, not the nearest 100. So first I annotate. I round 602 to the nearest 10. I circled 602 because that's the number I'm rounding. I circled nearest 10 to remind myself that I need to round to the nearest 10. I know that when I'm rounding to the nearest 10, my endpoints must be tens numbers. So I draw my number line. I label with my tens numbers. The two tens numbers closest to 602 are 600 and 610. These are tens numbers because I'm rounding to the nearest 10. I know my midpoint will be 605 because that is in the middle between 600 and 610. I fill in my number line with ones numbers, and then I mark 602 on my number line. The last step is I see which tens number is 602 closest to. Is it closest to 600 or 610? I can see from my number line that 602 is closest to 600. So when I'm rounding 602 to the nearest 10, it rounds to 600. It's closer to 600, not 610. I'm going to do 2 more for you here. So we're rounding 345 to the nearest 100. I'm going to start by drawing my number line. I know that if I'm rounding to the nearest 100, my endpoints need to be hundreds numbers. I'll have 300. I'll have 400. These are the two hundreds numbers around 345. I'll put my midpoint, which I know is 350. 350 is right in the middle of 300 and 400. I'm going to fill in my number line with tens numbers. 310, 320, 330, 340, 350 is my midpoint, 360, 370, 380, 390, 400 is my endpoint. This will make it easier when I go and mark 345 on my number line. I know that 345 will be right here. The final step is to ask myself, is 345 closer to 300 or 400? I can see from my number line that it's closer to 300. So 345 rounded to the nearest 100 is 300. We're going to skip down to number 10 because it's a little different with the directions. Number 10 says list all numbers that round to 120 when rounding to the nearest 10. So this problem is giving you the number that it's rounded to. It's asking which numbers round to 120 when rounding to the nearest 10. So I know that 120 needs to be an endpoint if I'm rounding. I know that if I'm rounding to the nearest 10, my endpoints will always be tens numbers. So here's 120 as an endpoint. I know my next tens number will be 130. I also know that 120 could be my second endpoint. This number line shows 120 as my first endpoint. I also need to see 120 as my second endpoint. If I have 120 as my second endpoint, the tens number that comes before that I know is 110. So now I have my two number lines. 120 is my first endpoint here, and on this number line it's my second endpoint. And I'm going to put my midpoint. I know that between 120 and 130, the midpoint is 125. I know between 110 and 120, my midpoint is 115. For both number lines, I'm going to fill in with ones numbers to make it easier to mark my number. 123, 124, 125 is my midpoint, 126, 127, 128, 129, 130. We'll do the same thing on this number line. 111, 112, 113, 114, 115 is my midpoint. 116, 117, 118, 19, 120. Remember, I had to do both number lines because 120 could be my first endpoint, but it could also be my second endpoint. Now I'm going to see all the numbers that round to 120. So I'm looking here. I see that 121 is closest to 120, not 130. So 121 rounds to 120. I see that 122 also rounds to 120. It's closer to 120, not 130. 123, closer to 120, not 130. 124, I also see that it's closer to 120, not 130. Now 125, I know my midpoint always rounds up, which means 125 is the midpoint, will round to 130. So 125 does not round to 120. 126, I know is closer to 130, does not round to 120. The rest of these numbers are all closer to 130. They will not round to 120. So I have 4 numbers so far that round to 120 when rounding to the nearest 10. Now I'm going to look at this number line. I can see that 119 is closer to 120, not 110. 119 rounds to 120. 118 is closer to 120, not 110. 117, I see it's closer to 120, not 110. 116, also closer to 120, not 110. Now I know my midpoint, we will always round up, which means 115 also rounds to 120. I'll keep going. 114. Now I'm realizing I'm on the other side of my midpoint, which means 114 is going to round down to 110. 114 does not work. 113 does not work. The rest of these numbers will all round down to 110. So here are my numbers that round to 120 when I'm rounding to the nearest 10.